I'm married, broke, and spending another New Year's holding everything together alone. I didn't plan on posting this, but tonight kind of broke me. I'm married. I have kids. On paper, I should feel like I have a partner, a home that feels safe, shared weight, shared responsibility. Instead, I spent New Year's Eve doing laundry, cooking dinner, feeding pets, putting kids to bed, alone. The house was quiet in that way that feels loud, not peaceful, not calm, just empty. This isn't new. I've spent multiple New Years like this, alone in a marriage, carrying everything, emotionally, financially, mentally. The kind of loneliness that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No screaming, no slammed doors. Just slow erosion, because you're never really seen. I folded clothes while fireworks went off somewhere else. I scrubbed dishes while other people counted down. I kissed my kids goodnight and smiled like this was normal. Then I stood in the kitchen, lights still on, hands wet from the sink, and I felt that familiar thought settle in. How am I going to keep doing this? On top of everything, there's the money, rent, bills, that constant low-grade panic humming in the background of every decision. I don't party, I don't waste money, I don't live extravagantly. I'm just trying to survive, trying to keep my kids stable, trying to make the math work when it doesn't want to. I've had the conversations, I've asked for help, I've tried to make changes, I've done the right things, and I'm still here, exhausted, overwhelmed, scared, pretending I'm fine for everyone else. What hurts the most is how easy people make it sound. Just change your situation, just leave, just do better. As if change doesn't require time, money, support. As if you can rearrange your life while you're already drowning. So no, I'm not posting this for pity. I just needed somewhere to say it. Somewhere I won't be told I'm dramatic or ungrateful. Because this isn't weakness. It's what happens when you hold everything together for too long and no one notices the cracks. There's a specific kind of loneliness that only exists inside relationships. It's worse than being single, because at least when you're alone, the silence makes sense. This silence doesn't. You lie next to someone, share a last name, share children, and still feel like you're carrying the entire structure on your back. People imagine loneliness as something loud, crying, breaking down, calling friends in the middle of the night. This isn't that. This is doing what needs to be done because no one else will, over and over, until it becomes invisible. You stop asking for help because asking takes energy you don't have. You stop explaining because explaining doesn't change anything. You stop expecting because expectation hurts more than acceptance. And slowly, your standards adjust, not because you want them to, because they have to. You learn how to function without being supported, how to budget exhaustion, how to stretch food, money, patience, how to say, it's fine, and mean, I don't have room to fall apart. The worst part isn't the work. It's the emotional math running in the background of everything. If I rest, something will fall apart. If I stop, who picks it up? If I'm honest, what do I lose? You start measuring your words, your needs, your reactions, because conflict feels like a luxury you can't afford. There's rent to worry about, kids watching, stability to fake, so you keep going. And people around you start assuming you're strong. They don't see that strength came from necessity, not choice. They don't see that you learned to hold everything together because the alternative was collapse, and collapse wasn't an option. At night, when the house finally quiets, that's when it hits. Not sadness exactly, more like a question that keeps returning. How did I get here? Not in one big decision, not in one dramatic mistake, but slowly, through compromise, through patience, through giving more than you had, through believing things would even out eventually. They tell you marriage is partnership, but no one tells you what to do when the partnership quietly disappears and you're left managing the aftermath. You start grieving something that technically still exists, a marriage that looks intact from the outside, a family that functions, a life that hasn't exploded. But inside, something fundamental is missing: presence, reliability, shared weight. And when you try to name it, people minimize it. At least you're not alone, at least you have kids, at least you're managing. As if not falling apart means you're okay. So you swallow it. You tell yourself this is just a phase, that things will improve when money's better, when stress eases, when life slows down. But deep down, another thought starts forming. What if this doesn't change? What if this is it? Not rock bottom, not disaster, just years of quiet endurance. That's the thought that scares you the most, because it doesn't feel dramatic enough to justify leaving, but it feels heavy enough to drain you completely. And on nights like this, New Year's Eve, when everyone else is celebrating fresh starts, you're just trying to make it through, without breaking. There's a moment that comes after exhaustion. Not when you're tired, not when you're overwhelmed, but when you realize the tiredness isn't temporary, it's structural. You wake up already behind, already calculating, already bracing. Not for emergencies, for normal days. That's when something shifts. You start noticing how much you carry, not just physically, but mentally. You remember appointments, deadlines, school forms, bills. You anticipate moods, manage reactions, smooth over tension before it becomes conflict. You're not just doing the work, you're holding the emotional architecture of the entire household. And no one ever formally assigned you this role. It just happened, little by little. One time you stepped in because it was easier, another time because you didn't want the kids to feel it, another time because you told yourself it wouldn't always be like this. Eventually, stepping in became expected. Silence became normal. You stopped asking, not because you didn't need help, but because asking required hope. And hope started to feel irresponsible. You learned to plan around disappointment, to assume you were on your own, to prepare backups for your backups, not because you wanted control, because no one else was holding the net. And here's the part people don't like hearing. You didn't become strong, you became necessary. If you rest, things unravel. If you pause, things stall. If you break, everything breaks. That's not empowerment. That's a trap. Because now leaving feels impossible. Changing feels reckless. Even imagining a different life feels selfish. You're not staying because you're happy. You're staying because too many people depend on you, and you don't trust the ground to hold them if you step away. That realization hits quietly, usually late at night, when the house is asleep and you're still awake, staring at the ceiling, doing math in your head that never works out. How long can I keep doing this? Not dramatically, just honestly. You think about the version of yourself from years ago, the one who believed partnership meant shared effort, shared worry, shared responsibility, and you wonder when that expectation quietly expired. There's grief in that question, because you didn't lose a person, you lost a role you thought you had. You lost the idea that someone would notice when you were struggling without being asked. You lost the safety of not having to be on all the time. And the hardest part, you don't even know how to explain this to someone else without sounding ungrateful. From the outside, your life still functions. Kids are fed, house stands, bills get paid, barely, but paid. So people assume you're okay. They don't see the cost. They don't see how every decision feels heavier because there's no margin for error, no cushion, no one to catch you if you fall. You start resenting small things, not because they're big, but because they're constant. The way you're always the one who notices what's missing, the way your stress is treated like background noise, the way your needs are postponed indefinitely. And then guilt shows up, because resentment feels dangerous, because you don't want to be bitter, you don't want to be angry, you just want to be supported. So you push the resentment down, but it doesn't disappear, it settles. It becomes heaviness in your chest, tension in your shoulders, a quiet numbness where joy used to land. You realize you're surviving, but you're not living. And that realization is terrifying because survival has been your entire identity for so long. You don't remember what living would even look like. You don't know how to want things for yourself anymore without feeling like you're taking something away from your kids or risking the fragile balance you've built. So instead of leaving, instead of confronting, instead of exploding, you endure. And endurance starts to feel like character, like responsibility, like morality. But deep down, another thought keeps surfacing. This isn't sustainable, not forever. Something has to change, either the situation or you. And that's where fear creeps in. Because change costs money, energy, support, all the things you don't have. So you stay still, not because you're weak, but because you're already carrying too much to gamble on uncertainty. And that's when awareness fully sets in. This isn't just a hard season. This is a system that runs on your exhaustion. And the question quietly forming now isn't, can I keep going? It's, what happens to me if I do?
There's a thought that feels almost forbidden when it first appears. It doesn't sound dramatic. It doesn't even sound angry. It sounds small. What if I stopped doing everything? Not abandon the kids, not walk out in the middle of the night, not blow everything up, just stop compensating. Stop smoothing, stop anticipating, stop absorbing the fallout before it reaches anyone else. That thought doesn't arrive with confidence, it arrives with fear. Because if you stop, things will show. The gaps, the imbalance, the truth of who's actually holding the structure up. And you've been trained not to let that happen. You've learned that being the responsible one means preventing collapse at all costs. So even imagining letting go feels reckless, selfish, dangerous. But once the thought exists, it doesn't leave. It shows up while you're doing the dishes, while you're checking bank balances, while you're lying awake listening to someone else sleep. What if I didn't fix this? What if I didn't step in? What if the consequences finally landed where they belong? That's when you realize something uncomfortable. You've been protecting other people from the impact of their absence. You've been absorbing consequences that weren't yours to carry, and the system works only because you do. That's the quiet betrayal of endurance. It rewards those who do less and punishes those who do more. The moment you stop overfunctioning, the imbalance becomes visible, which is exactly why you've been afraid to stop. Because visibility leads to confrontation, and confrontation threatens stability. So you've chosen silence. But silence has a cost. It drains you slowly. It erases you in increments small enough that no one panics, until one day you realize you're not just tired, you're disappearing. Your wants feel distant. Your preferences feel optional. Your inner life feels like something you'll get back to later. Later becomes years, and something in you starts to resist that outcome. Not loudly, just enough to notice. You start questioning the stories you've been telling yourself.
I'm doing this for the kids. I'm just being patient. This is what commitment looks like. And you realize how often commitment has meant self-erasure, how often loyalty has been one-sided, how often being strong has been code for don't ask for anything. You don't hate your life, but you don't recognize yourself in it anymore, and that's where the shift happens. You begin experimenting with small refusals. You don't remind someone. You don't fix the mistake immediately. You don't soften your tone to keep the peace. Nothing explodes, but something changes. The silence feels different, less heavy, more honest. You notice discomfort ripple outward, not from you, but from others. They feel the absence of your invisible labor, and for the first time, it's not your job to resolve that discomfort. That realization is both terrifying and freeing, because it means the system was never fair. It just depended on your silence. You start imagining a life where you don't have to constantly brace, where your energy isn't spent holding everything together, where rest isn't something you earn by collapsing. The idea feels distant, but it feels real enough to hurt. And that's important, because pain is often the first sign that something inside you still wants more, still believes you're allowed to exist beyond survival. You're not ready to leave, you're not ready to burn things down, but you are ready for one truth. This cannot continue exactly as it is. Something has to give, and for the first time, you're considering that it doesn't have to be you.
There's a moment when you realize the problem isn't just what you're carrying, it's who you've had to become to carry it. You don't notice the change all at once. It happens gradually. You become more practical, less emotional, more efficient. You stop reacting, you start managing. You learn how to swallow disappointment quickly because there isn't time to process it. You tell yourself you'll deal with your feelings later. Later becomes a place you never quite reach. At some point, you stop asking yourself what you want, not because you don't have desires, but because wanting feels dangerous when you don't know if it can be met. So you lower your expectations quietly. You say things like, "It's not that bad. Other people have it worse. At least the kids are okay." You become very good at gratitude, but gratitude starts to feel like a shield, something you hide behind so you don't have to admit what's missing. You look at your life from the outside, and it almost convinces you you're functioning, you're responsible, you're dependable. People trust you, they lean on you, they come to you when things fall apart, and you don't resent them for that. But sometimes you wonder who you would be if you didn't have to be the strong one. You miss parts of yourself you can't quite name. The version of you that laughed without calculating the cost. The version of you that rested without guilt. The version of love that included being taken care of. You don't hate your partner, but you feel distant from the idea of partnership. You don't feel chosen. You feel assigned. Assigned the role of stabilizer, of caretaker, of the one who makes sure nothing collapses. You start noticing how often your own emotions feel inconvenient. Sadness feels impractical, anger feels risky, hope feels irresponsible. So you keep your inner world small, contained, controlled, and slowly you stop sharing it altogether. You don't talk about how lonely you feel because you're tired of explaining. You don't talk about money fear because it never leads to solutions. You don't talk about resentment because you're afraid of what it would unleash. Instead, you perform competence, and competence becomes your personality. People admire you for it. They say things like, "I don't know how you do it. You're so strong. I could never handle what you handle." They mean it as praise, but it lands like confirmation. This is who you are now, the one who handles things. And somewhere along the way, you start grieving yourself.
Not the life you wanted, but the self you've lost access to. The part of you that felt soft, that expected reciprocity, that believed love included effort from both sides. You realize you've been shrinking your needs to fit into a space that was never designed to hold you fully. And that realization hurts more than exhaustion, because exhaustion implies rest would fix it. This feels deeper, like an identity misalignment, like you've been living as a role instead of a person. You wonder what would happen if you stopped being the reliable one, if you allowed yourself to be needy, messy, uncertain. The thought scares you because reliability has kept you safe. It's earned you stability. It's protected your kids from chaos, but it's also cost you intimacy. You feel unseen, not because no one is looking, but because no one is looking for you. They're looking for what you provide. And the scariest part, you don't know how to ask for more without risking everything you've built. So you stay quiet. You keep going. But now there's awareness, and awareness changes things. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You start noticing every time you suppress yourself, every time you choose peace over honesty, every time you minimize your own pain to keep things running. And a question starts forming beneath all of it. If this is who I have to be to keep this life, is this life actually mine?
There comes a point where fear changes shape. At first, you're afraid of change, of disruption, of instability, of what leaving might do to your kids, your finances, your sense of safety. Fear keeps you still. But slowly, another fear grows beside it. The fear of staying. Not staying through a hard season, not staying while things improve. Staying like this. Staying while parts of you quietly shut down. Staying while resentment settles into your bones. Staying until this version of you becomes permanent. That fear doesn't shout. It whispers. It shows up when you realize you don't remember the last time you felt excited about the future. When you stop imagining later, because later looks exactly like now. You start noticing the years slipping by, not in memories, but in routines. The same arguments that never resolve, the same promises that never turn into action, the same imbalance explained away with stress or timing. You tell yourself it's just temporary, but deep down you know temporary things move. This hasn't moved. You begin asking questions you used to avoid. What am I modeling for my kids? What am I teaching them about love, about partnership, about self-worth? Not in theory, in practice. They see who carries the weight. They see who adapts. They see who gets tired and keeps going anyway. They learn what's normal from what you tolerate. That thought hurts because you've told yourself you're staying for them. But now you're not so sure what "for them" actually means. You don't want them to grow up thinking love is endurance, that commitment means disappearing quietly, that being needed is the same as being valued. You realize something else too. If nothing changes, one day they'll ask why you stayed, and you don't know if "I was afraid" will feel like a good enough answer. That realization tightens something in your chest. Because fear has been your reason for a long time. Fear of money running out, fear of destabilizing their lives, fear of being judged, fear of starting over without guarantees. But now, fear has competition, regret. You imagine yourself years from now, older, still capable, still holding things together, and tired in a way rest can't touch. You imagine explaining your life to someone new and realizing you don't recognize the story you're telling. That image unsettles you because it feels possible, likely even. You don't want drama. You don't want revenge. You don't want to blow everything up. You just want relief. You want to breathe without calculating consequences. You want to feel supported instead of managed. You want your presence to matter beyond what you provide. And that's when the truth becomes unavoidable. Staying has a cost. It's just a quieter one. Paid in years, in missed versions of yourself,
in emotional numbness that creeps in slowly enough to feel normal. You've been told leaving would be selfish, that breaking the family would be unforgivable, but no one talks about the cost of staying broken. No one talks about what it does to a person to live in constant self-suppression, to be needed but not met, to be relied on but not relieved. You realize that the choice isn't between good and bad, it's between two fears, the fear of change and the fear of disappearing. And suddenly, staying still doesn't feel like safety anymore. It feels like slow loss. You don't know what you're going to do yet. You're not packing bags. You're not making announcements. But something inside you has crossed a line. You're no longer convincing yourself this is fine. You're no longer numbing the question. You're letting it exist. What if my life could be different? That question doesn't demand an answer right away, but it refuses to go back to sleep. And once it's awake, everything changes. Because even if you stay for now, you're no longer staying blindly.
Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Not the numb kind, the observant kind. After the question wakes up, what if my life could be different? You don't rush to answer it. You watch. You start noticing patterns you used to excuse. Who follows through? Who doesn't? Who benefits from your effort? Who barely notices it exists? You notice how quickly things fall to you without being discussed, how responsibility doesn't get assigned, it just lands. You stop interrupting the pattern. You let silence stretch a little longer. You let others feel the pause. Not to punish, just to see. And what you see is clarifying. You realize how much of the system runs on your anticipation, your reminders, your emotional buffering, your quiet corrections. You've been managing outcomes behind the scenes. Once you stop smoothing everything over, reality gets louder, and for the first time, it's not your job to mute it. You also start thinking about money differently, not with panic, with precision. You look at numbers without flinching. You calculate what survival actually costs, what independence would require. You notice how often finances have been used as a reason to keep things exactly as they are, not as a shared problem, as a barrier. You stop dreaming in abstractions and start thinking in logistics: rent, food, childcare, time. Not fantasies, plans. Quiet ones. You don't announce this shift. You don't threaten change. You simply become less available for dysfunction, and that alone changes the air. You realize how much emotional labor you've been doing to preserve comfort for everyone else. You stop translating, stop softening, stop rescuing conversations from discomfort. You let statements stand as they are, let reactions land where they land. It feels uncomfortable at first, because you're used to being the bridge. But bridges wear down when too much weight passes over them without reinforcement. You start conserving energy, not withdrawing love, just refusing to waste yourself. You go to bed earlier, you speak less, you listen more. Not to be agreeable, to gather information. You notice how often your exhaustion was treated as background noise, how quickly things resumed once you pushed through. You stop pushing, and no one thanks you for it. That's another lesson. You realize how conditional appreciation has been, how invisible your effort was until it stopped. That doesn't make you angry, it makes you clear. You also start emotionally detaching, not from your kids, but from the fantasy of who you thought your partner would become. You stop waiting for potential to activate. You stop investing in future versions that never arrive. You accept what is, and acceptance doesn't weaken you, it steadies you, because now you're responding to reality instead of hope. You stop explaining yourself to people who've already decided not to understand. You stop oversharing your inner world. You protect it, not because you're closing off, but because you're preparing. You realize that leaving, if it ever happens, won't be dramatic. It will be quiet, the result of many small decisions stacked carefully over time.
And whether you leave or stay, you know one thing for certain now. You cannot go back to who you were, the version of you who carried everything without question, the version who mistook endurance for love. That version is gone. In its place is someone calmer, someone less reactive, someone who understands that survival is not the goal, sustainability is. You're not rushing toward an exit, but you are no longer standing still. And even if no one else notices yet, you do. Boundaries don't announce themselves. They don't come with speeches, or ultimatums, or dramatic declarations. They show up quietly, in what you no longer rush to fix, in what you no longer explain away, in what you allow to stay unresolved. At first, it feels strange. You're so used to stepping in early that not doing so feels like negligence. But it isn't. It's restraint. You stop reminding. You stop double-checking. You stop carrying responsibility that was never officially yours. And something interesting happens. People notice. Not because you say anything, but because the system starts wobbling without your constant correction. Tasks get missed, tension lingers longer, silence stretches, and instead of rushing to repair it, you let it be uncomfortable. That discomfort used to belong to you, now it doesn't. You watch how others respond when you don't soften the edges for them. Some step up, others get irritated. A few act confused, as if something essential has gone missing and they can't quite name what it is. You don't rush to clarify. You don't apologize for the shift. You simply continue as you are, calm, present, unavailable for dysfunction. This is when dynamics start to change, because boundaries don't just protect you, they reveal. They reveal who relied on your silence, who benefited from your overfunctioning, who mistook your endurance for agreement. You notice how quickly guilt tries to surface. The old reflex. Am I being selfish? Am I making things harder than they need to be? Am I causing problems? You let those thoughts pass. You remind yourself that discomfort is not damage, that someone else feeling the weight does not mean you've done something wrong. You start answering questions differently, not defensively, not with long explanations, just honestly. Short sentences, clear boundaries, no emotional cushioning. And people react to that. Some push back. They test the boundary. They wait for you to revert. You don't. You stay steady. And that steadiness becomes unsettling because it means this isn't a phase. This isn't burnout. This is change. You also notice how much space opens up internally. Without constant vigilance, your mind gets quieter. You're not scanning for what might go wrong. You're not anticipating needs before they're expressed. You're present in your own body in a way you haven't been in years. It feels unfamiliar, almost dangerous, but also relieving. You start trusting yourself again, not because everything is fixed, but because you're no longer betraying yourself to keep things running. You realize how often you used to negotiate against your own limits, how easily you overrode your instincts for the sake of harmony. Now, harmony is no longer your highest value. Honesty is. And honesty doesn't always feel peaceful. Sometimes it feels tense, quiet, charged, but it feels real. You begin to see the relationship more clearly, not as a story of potential, but as it exists right now. You stop filling in the gaps with hope. You stop assuming intention where there is only habit. And that clarity hurts, but it also stabilizes you. Because now, whatever decision comes next will be based on reality, not fantasy, not fear. You don't know yet what the outcome will be. You're not forcing answers, but you can feel the shift. Others feel it too. They respond differently to you. Some with resistance, some with adjustment, some with distance. You let those reactions happen. You don't chase reassurance. You don't seek permission. You understand something now. You are not responsible for maintaining comfort at the cost of your own well-being. You were never meant to be the shock absorber for everyone else's inaction. And whether this path leads to repair or separation or something you haven't imagined yet, you know one thing with certainty. You are no longer the person who disappears quietly so everything else can stay the same. That version of you ended when you stopped carrying what wasn't yours.
There's a moment when you realize you don't need to explain anymore. Not because you've given up, but because the truth has become visible on its own. When you stop compensating, life starts responding honestly. Things don't fall apart dramatically. They just stop being held together artificially. Responsibilities sit where they land. Missed steps stay missed. Silence stays silent. And for the first time, you don't rush in to save the story. You let the gaps speak. You notice how often you used to argue for your own reality, how often you tried to make someone else see what you were carrying. Now, you don't. You don't persuade, you don't convince, you don't plead for understanding. You simply stop filling the space. And something changes. People begin to experience consequences that used to pass through you. Not harsh ones, just real ones. The weight they avoided starts settling where it belongs. At first, there's confusion, questions, defensiveness, small irritations. You don't engage. You answer plainly, briefly, without emotional charge. That neutrality unsettles people because it removes the argument. There's nothing to push against. You're not accusing, you're not demanding, you're just no longer absorbing. And that forces clarity. You notice how differently people respond when they can't rely on your emotional labor. Some step up slowly, others withdraw, a few grow resentful, not because you've changed who you are, but because you've stopped being who you were for them. You feel the urge to explain, to soften it, to reassure them you're not angry. You resist that urge, not out of cruelty, out of respect for yourself. You realize something important. If someone only feels comfortable when you're overextending, that comfort was never mutual. You don't need to name this aloud. It becomes obvious through behavior, through what changes and what doesn't, through who adapts and who waits for you to return to your old role. You start seeing the relationship without distortion, no longer filtered through hope or fear, just facts, patterns, consistency, or the lack of it. And strangely, this clarity brings peace. Not happiness, peace. Because uncertainty was exhausting, because constantly wondering if things would ever change was draining you more than the reality itself. Now, you know. You don't need to imagine outcomes. You're watching them unfold. You also notice something else. You feel less reactive, less desperate to be understood. You're grounded in your own experience now. You trust what you see. You trust what you feel. That trust steadies you, even when the outcome isn't what you hoped for, especially then. You realize that confrontation isn't always necessary. Sometimes the strongest statement is consistency. You keep your boundaries, you keep your calm, you keep your integrity. You don't reward effort that appears only when pressure builds. You don't collapse your needs to restore temporary peace. You let things take the shape they're going to take. And that's when the truth stands on its own. No speeches required, no ultimatums issued, just reality, unbuffered. You don't feel triumphant, you feel clear. You feel sad in places, relieved in others, but you don't feel lost anymore. Because now you understand something deeply. You were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person to meet you halfway. And whatever comes next will come from this place of clarity, not exhaustion, not fear, but grounded truth. You don't know yet whether this leads to repair or separation or something in between, but you know this: you will not return to silence.
You will not return to self-erasure. You will not carry the cost of someone else's absence just to keep the illusion intact. That chapter is closed, not with noise, but with certainty.
After the truth stands, nothing dramatic happens. No sudden clarity, no clean ending. Life just keeps going. You still wake up early, still make meals, still help with homework, still worry about money. The difference is subtle, but everything feels different because you're no longer pretending. You're no longer carrying an extra layer of denial on top of everything else. That alone changes how the days feel. There's a strange calm in knowing where things actually stand. Not peace, but stability. You stop waiting for conversations that never come. You stop hoping behavior will change without effort. You stop interpreting silence as potential. And that frees up space. Not external space, internal space. You notice how much energy you used to spend managing disappointment before it arrived. Now disappointment just is. And because you're not fighting it, it doesn't drain you the same way. You're not constantly bracing. You're responding. That shift matters. You start making decisions without running them through guilt first. Small ones. What you eat, when you rest, what you say no to. You stop apologizing for needing things. You stop explaining why you're tired. You stop asking permission to exist in your own life. And no one applauds. No one announces that you're doing the right thing. But something steadier replaces that need. Self-trust. You trust your perceptions now. You trust that what you felt wasn't imaginary. You trust that exhaustion was information, not failure. You trust that you didn't wake up one day wanting more for no reason. That trust anchors you, even when the future still feels uncertain. Some days feel heavy. You still grieve what you hoped this life would be. You still feel sadness for the version of you that kept giving, waiting for it to balance out. You honor her now, not by repeating her sacrifices, but by refusing to disappear the way she did. Other days feel lighter, not because things are easier, but because you're no longer carrying resentment on top of responsibility. You're no longer silently angry at yourself for staying quiet. You've stopped abandoning yourself, and that changes the texture of everything. You realize strength doesn't feel like pushing anymore. It feels like alignment. Your actions match your values. Your silence has intention. Your boundaries don't need justification. You don't feel the need to prove anything. You're not trying to teach anyone a lesson. You're just living honestly. And honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is less exhausting than pretending. You also notice how your kids respond. They don't know all the details, but they sense the shift. They see you calmer, more present, less brittle. They see you rest without guilt. They see you say no without apologizing. They see you take up space. And without a lecture, they learn something important. That love doesn't require self-erasure. That responsibility doesn't mean silence. That being strong doesn't mean being invisible. You don't know what the long-term outcome will be, whether this leads to rebuilding or redefining or eventually walking away. You're not rushing toward conclusions. You're grounded where you are, and that grounding feels new. You realize you're no longer living in constant reaction. You're choosing, even when the choices are small, even when they're quiet, especially then. There's a kind of peace in knowing you're no longer lying to yourself. You're no longer calling survival fine. You're no longer postponing your life indefinitely. Whatever comes next will come from this place, a place of clarity, of self-respect, of quiet strength that doesn't need witnesses. And if this is where the story pauses, it pauses with you still standing, not because everything worked out, but because you finally stopped carrying what was never yours alone. Time passes differently after everything stops being a fight. Not faster, not slower, just quieter. The days don't suddenly become easier. Money doesn't magically stretch further. Life doesn't reorganize itself out of gratitude. But something important is gone. The constant tension,
the feeling that you're bracing for impact every moment of the day. You stop waking up already tired, not rested, just no longer clenched. You still do the work, still handle responsibilities, still worry sometimes, but you're no longer carrying resentment on top of survival. That weight mattered more than you realized. You don't think about the relationship the same way anymore, not with anger, not with hope, just realism. You see it clearly now, not as a failure, not as a tragedy, just as something that was never evenly held. And clarity, even when it's painful, is stabilizing. You stop asking, why didn't they change? You stop replaying conversations. You stop trying to extract meaning from silence. You understand something simple. If someone wanted to meet you where you were, they would have. You don't say that bitterly. You say it the way you accept gravity. You also stop asking yourself what you could have done differently. You already know the answer. You did everything you could without disappearing completely, and that matters. You notice how your kids feel around you now. They don't know the words for it, but they feel the difference. They feel that you're present without being stretched thin. They feel that you're not pretending anymore. And that teaches them something without you ever saying it. That love doesn't mean exhaustion. That commitment doesn't mean silence. That strength doesn't mean self-erasure. You don't talk badly about anyone. You don't rewrite the past to make it uglier. You don't need to. The truth stands on its own now. You're not chasing closure. You're living with clarity, and that's enough. Some nights are still heavy. Sometimes grief sneaks in, not for what was, but for what never existed. The partnership you thought you were building, the support you kept expecting. You let yourself feel that. You don't rush it away. You don't shame yourself for it. Grief doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you cared. Other nights feel surprisingly peaceful. You sit in the quiet without needing to fill it. You breathe without calculating. You exist without performing. And in those moments, you realize something important. You didn't lose yourself. You found yourself again. Not the old version, not the one who hoped harder, the one who knows her limits and honors them, the one who understands that survival is not the finish line. Sustainability is. You don't know exactly what the future holds. You don't need to. You've stopped demanding certainty from a life that never offered it. You trust yourself now, and that trust is steady. Whatever happens next, repair, distance, separation, redefinition, it will happen with your eyes open. Not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from self-respect. You're no longer invisible in your own life, and that changes everything. So if you're listening to this on a night where the house feels too quiet and the weight feels familiar, know this. You're not weak for feeling it. You're not dramatic for naming it. You're not failing because you're tired. You're human. And sometimes the bravest thing you do is stop carrying what was never meant to be yours alone. That's not the end of the story, but it is the end of pretending. And that's where real life finally begins.